This is the sound of Mull, and if you were standing here in 1484, you would have had a pretty good view of what was said to be an epic naval battle between different factions of Clan Donald. Now, throughout history, there's been many conflicts between sons and their fathers, and none was more brutal than the conflict between John of Islay, Lord of the Isles, against his rebellious son, Angus Og. Now, the feud was over Clan Donald because the lordship of the Isles was the lordship of the Scottish Isles on the west coast and had been in Clan Donald's possession for hundreds of years, all the way back to the legendary Somerled, who was the first Lord of the Isles. Now, the King of Scotland, he had stripped John of Islay of the Earldom of Ross and many lands of the Lordship of the Isles after uncovering that John of Islay was in a secret treaty with the King of England, which was the Treaty of Ardtornish. Now, upon discovery of that, King of Scotland stripped the Lordship of the Isles of many lands, and John of Islay had to essentially bow down, and he just took what King James laid down to him. Now, Angus Og, his son, and many other members of Clan Donald, Anseps, seen this as real weakness from John of Islay, and they weren't that happy about it. So Angus Og decided to take up arms and started a rebellion. Now, none other than these conflicts were more brutal than the one that accumulated here. It was known as the Battle of Bloody Bay. Now, what happened a few years before this battle was that John of Islay, he was the Lord of the Isles, and he was stripped of these titles by the King James in Edinburgh, and this led to a lot of inner conflicts in Clan Donald because many saw John surrendered these titles that had been held by Clan Donald for hundreds of years. They had seen that as really weak forfeiture, but John of Islay, he wasn't really seen as a really strong chief. On the other hand, his son Angus Og, he was seen as like the old style kind of Celtic warrior. You know, he kept the traditions true of Clan Donald. You know, he was a fierce warrior, and he won a lot of battles and grew a reputation as being, you know, like a really staunch rebel by the crown. Now, as a result of this, the King of Scotland at the time, he arranged for the Earl of Argyll and the Earl of Atholl to assemble a force to attack Angus Og, because he had separated from his father, and a lot of factions from Clan Donald had supported Angus Og. And during this time, he was carrying out raids in the Earldom of Ross, which had been removed from his father's control due to the discovery of the Treaty of Ardtornish, which was a secret alliance between the Lordship of the Isles and the King of England, King Edward IV. Now, the whole purpose of that was to go to Ardtornish, which was, you know, the seat of power of the Lordship of the Isles. That was like the court where a lot of these important meetings were held, where the House of Islay, who were the Lord of the Isles for hundreds of years, their main castle was on Finlagan in Islay, but they had this ancient castle, Ardtornish, which was really an assembly point, and a lot of important meetings was held there, like the Treaty of Ardtornish. So the Treaty of Ardtornish, that was signed in 1462 at Ardtornish Castle by emissaries of King Edward IV and of John of Islay, who's the Lord of the Isles. Now, this treaty and this secret meetings, this was not known to the Scottish Crown at the time. So during this date, this agreement was forged, and essentially the outlines of the agreement was an alliance between the two. So if one or the other was attacked by the Kingdom of Scotland, the other would come to the aid. Alternatively, also, that if one attacked the Kingdom of Scotland, then the other would come to the support. So this treaty was hidden away and buried in the archives of England, and it wasn't talked about for many years later. So that treaty was signed and put away. Now, nothing really came of it because England kind of got a little preoccupied with the War of the Roses, which was going on a few years after the signing of the Treaty of Ardtornish. In and around that event, it was a long war. So England was preoccupied with inner faction fighting in its own country. It didn't have the men and the resources to launch an assault on Scotland, even though they'd signed this Treaty of Ardtornish. So the treaty just kind of lay dormant and it wasn't really used. So this treaty is then discovered 12 years later by the King of Scotland. So then upon learning this, John of Islay, he's summoned to court and essentially stripped of all his titles, he's forfeited all his titles, because this is seen as heinous treason. Amongst other things John of Islay he'd been doing many raids in northern Scotland years before it, but he'd been such a powerful magnet that the King of Scotland, King James at the time, they couldn't do much to stop him. So what happened is he was brought to court and essentially forfeiture was given to all his titles, all his lands, all his possessions. Now upon him coming to court and begging essentially mercy, the court then gave him back all his lands, but it was seen as the only reason they did this was for him to willingly forfeit some of his lands, and one of these lands was the Earldom of Ross. Now this had been in Clan Donald's possession for many decades, so this was seen, it was seen as him having to willingly forfeit it. Now a lot of people who weren't happy about this was other coherents of Clan Donald, especially none more so than Angus Og, who was the son of John of Islay. Now Angus Og was seen as a really strong up-and-coming warrior. He had this reputation of being like a strong Gael and sticking with the traditions of the clan. In contrast to his father John of Islay, who'd been seen as like this kind of like bishop kind of character, kind of weak, and a lot of he actually resided in Dingwall, which was the seat of power in the Earldom of Ross. So he wasn't actually staying on the Isle of Islay, which a lot of his ancestors who were Lord of the Isles had done. So the Earldom of Ross had now been stripped from Clan Donald, and that was a huge swathe of land in the northwestern part of Scotland. So this is what led to this battle. It was essentially a little civil war between the two clans. So then Angus Og, he had commanded a lot of support from Clan Donald, so then he started doing a lot of raids in the Earldom of Ross. And obviously news of this reached King James, and then the King James at the time, he arranged for the Earl of Atholl and the Earl of Argyll to assemble a force and a navy to go and deal with Angus Og, because Clan Donald, they were a seafaring clan, so they'd sailed up to the Sound of Mull, the northern end of Ardnamurchan, and then they had been doing raids in there. So during this time, Angus Og and his army, now this is another thing about this battle, that the numbers aren't really known, but there are accounts of the battle known through very reliable sources, historians of Clan Donald, which go back a good 100 or so years, and they've been collected and reeditioned, revised in modern books. So there is accounts of this battle was of epic proportions. Apparently one of the biggest naval battles since the time of Somerled. Could have ranged from somewhere up to 100 ships between the two forces. So Angus Og, he was at the northern end of Ardnamurchan. Now in the meantime, the MacLean of Ardgour, he was a part of John of Islay's side of this faction. So you had Angus Og on one side, a lot of coherents of Clan Donald on his side, and then you had the other side, John of Islay. Now one of his kind of lieutenants was a MacLean of Ardgour, and during this time, so the Earl of Atholl and the Earl of Argyll, they were siding with John of Islay, because John of Islay was kind of staying loyal to the crown. He'd been kind of subdued, and he was essentially trying to stay loyal to the crown. Unlike his rebellious son who fought his father, just got rid of this title, he kind of caved in far too easy. That was kind of what he saw it as. So during this time, the Earl of Atholl, the Earl of Argyll, and the MacLean of Ardgour, along with John of Islay, they were all sailing up with their navy up the Sound of Mull looking for Angus Og, because they heard that he had been anchored at the northern side of Ardnamurchan, and he had been kept there for 5 weeks due to bad weather. So obviously the navy had been sitting for a while, so obviously reports would have reached their ears in Edinburgh. Now during this time, the MacLean of Ardgour, he was leading the charge of the navy from the royalist side. Now as he was coming up he spotted the fleet of Angus Og. So then at this point, they came and met at Bloody Bay, which is known as Bloody Bay. Now, on the two sides of Clan Donald, on John of Isla's side, there was Clan Maclean, Clan MacNeil, Clan MacLeod, there was the Earl of Athol and the Earl of Argyll. Now, on Angus Og's side, there was Clan MacDonald of Sleat, Clan MacDonald of Keppoch, MacLeod of Lewis, and Clan MacDonald of Clanranald. So during this time, the MacLean of Ardgour, he was at the head of the navy that was being commanded by the Earls of Athol and the Earl of Argyll and John of Islay, but it is unclear who was really in command here, because John of Islay, you know, he's really submitted to King James of Scotland, you know, after he'd been stripped of the earldom of Ross. So it's, you know, we can maybe speculate maybe the Earls of Athol and the Earls of Argyll were in command of this navy really because they'd been commissioned by the king to raise this navy, along with John of Islay, who was essentially put in command of it, because what we do know is the Earl of Athol and the Earl of Argyll, they did keep a bit of distance from the actual battle itself that happened apparently just behind me here. So this is apparently the Battle of Bloody Bay, the actual bay where the battles took place here. So you see the northern part of Ardnamurchan is where Angus Og's fleet would have came down to meet MacLean of Ardgour and their ships. So with the Earl of Athol and Earl of Argyll actually keeping their distance, it was really John of Islay and MacLean of Ardgour. And it is really grey, this battle here. I'm not going to just sit and pretend I know what happened, because I've did a lot of research and there's really little details what actually happened, so you have to really use your own imagination. But what we do know is the battle did take place here, and it was a battle apparently of epic proportions. Now, if it was a battle of epic proportions, it would have been great if somebody noted down the numbers. But obviously, you know, there wouldn't have been too many historians on these boats, you know, taking little notes whilst all these ships are crashing into each other. So the MacLean of Ardgour, he was leading towards Angus Og. Now at this point, his ship is apparently attacked by the head of Angus Og's ship. So one of the men on Angus Og's ships actually apparently puts an oar in between the stern on MacLean of Ardgour's boat, which actually disables it and it doesn't allow it to actually steer. So then upon that point, they boarded MacLean of Ardgour's ship and actually captured him amongst a few others. Now, MacLean of Ardgour, so obviously, just to obviously focus on the battle as well, it's hard for me to explain it because we don't know the numbers and I don't want to make things up, but maybe it's something for you to imagine yourself. You know, these galleys, these ships, they wouldn't have been the longboats, you know, like Viking longboats, but they wouldn't have been too far off it, because Somerled, you know, his ships, they were called Berlins, and these were really faster moving ships than longboats, and they were more suited to, you know, short, not sea kind of travels, but more in these locks, and if you're in Norway, these fjords type of like lakes, you know, like faster moving between islands. Now, obviously, ships would have evolved a bit from that point, but it would have been something like that. You know, there would have been massive galleon ships that you see in the later 16th, 17th centuries. They would have been a bit smaller than that, but they still would have been large enough to carry, you know, 50 to 80 men, some of them more. So MacLean of Ardgour's ship, he's actually captured, and the result of that battle is actually a victory for Angus Og, and apparently it's a unanimous victory. And he had just been building up his reputation. He had won a few battles in the earldom of Ross against the Mackenzies and Rosses, because he had seen their influence growing, and with the you know, the chastity of his father and his essential power, which he thought had been stripped away from him from King James, he took it up in himself, along with many supporters of Clan Donald, to try and seek retribution in the earldom of Ross and kind of try to subdue the emergence of some of these clans like Clan Mackenzie that were coming up and emerging at this time in the earldom of Ross, because it had been forfeited by John of Islay, forcibly by King James. So he had really established himself as a military leader, and he'd grown a large following within Clan Donald from this. And you know, these battles in the earldom of Ross, they held him in good stead because he carried it on here, winning this battle of Bloody Bay. Now, MacLean of Ardgour, as I said before, he was captured, and he was actually going to be executed on the orders of Angus Og. But apparently John of Moidart who was of the Clan Ranald branch, he was on the side of Angus Og. He actually chipped in to Angus Og and apparently said to him, you know, don't hang MacLean of Ardgour, because if you hang him, then I'm not going to have anyone to kind of bicker with, because MacLean of Ardgour and John of Mordor, they had a bit of history before it. So then he actually made his escape after that, or he made his escape with his life, and he was, you know, set free. But this battle here, you imagine just this bay here, just, you know, a vast array. It could have been 100 ships. It could have been more. It would have been pretty epic to see in a naval battle at sea at this time. Also, try and imagine this, because obviously we don't. This is that account I told you of the MacLean of Ardgour's boat being boarded and him being captured. That is one of the few accounts we actually have of the battle. So you really have to imagine what it would have been like, you know, out here in this location, these battles coming together with the rain that you saw earlier and the wind. It would have been quite hectic. You know, you're crashing into each other, boarding each other's ships, attacking the other, and trying to steal the ship. You know, it would have been pretty epic to see if you were in this area here, because you would have had a good view of it here. So, upon the aftermath of this battle, so Angus Og has really built himself up as a reputation here, defeated his father, so his father didn't die from here. There was no other large casualties. You know, John of Islay went back, the Earls of Atholl, the Earl of Argyll, they kind of went back to in the land. But the Earl of Atholl and the Earl of Argyll, they hatched a little plan, because it's apparently said that near in the immediate aftermath of this battle, with the assistance of the Earl of Argyll, the Earl of Atholl made his way to Finlagan Castle on Islay. Now there was Angus Og's wife and his son Donald Dhu. So what happened there is the Earl of Atholl, he kidnaps Angus Og's son from Finlagan Castle, and he transports him to Argyll and gives him to Colin, who was the Earl of Argyll at the time. Now a little backstory there is Angus Og's wife was the daughter of the Earl of Argyll. So, you know, there's a lot of interconnection with the families here. So Angus Og, his wife, they had a son, Donald Dhu. So Donald Dhu's actual grandfather was the Earl of Argyll. Apparently his name was Colin at the time, Earl of Argyll. So his grandfather captures his grandson, Donald Dhu, takes him from Islay, Finlagan Castle, and then takes him to a castle in Argyll. Now, so the reason Donald Dhu was captured, because he had been seen as illegitimate. But the fact is, if he was that illegitimate, it would suffice to prevent his succession to the honours and possessions of Clan Donald. So, you know, he didn't really need to kidnap him, because the government would be most unlikely to grant a charter of legitimation in his favour if he was, you know, illegitimate. So hence, if the story had been true, the measure of consigning Donald to perpetual captivity would have been altogether, you know, unnecessary. But it was because of Donald's legal birth and his undoubted right to succeed his father that the dastardly device was adopted of stealing the unoffending child and making him virtually a prisoner for life by, you know, how the Earl of Argyll and the Earl of Atholl. So a lot of these events as well, it's hard to paint a really clear picture, because there's a lot of grey areas over these like time periods. It's not very well documented. There is a lot of grey spots, but it's said that the battle did take place here, and this is without any real concrete evidence. But it's said, to the best estimates of the evidence available, that it was 1484 the battle was carried out here. Angus Og's victory did come with consequences. His rebellion against his father weakened the overall power of the Lordship of the Isles, and the internal strife within Clan Donald, you know, it made it easier for the Scottish Crown to intervene in the affairs of the Isles. Eventually, in 1493, you know, the Lordship of the Isles was forfeited to the Crown by John of Islay, largely as a result of the internal divisions within the clan, which were exacerbated at this battle. You know, battles like this, the Battle of Bloody Bay. Now, Angus Og MacDonald, he continued to be a powerful figure in the region, but the forfeiture of the Lordship of the Isles, it marked the decline of the MacDonalds' dominance in the Hebrides and Western Scotland. So the Scottish Crown gradually brought the region under tighter control, diminishing the independent power of that the lords of the Isles once held. And you know, through that disbandment of the lordship of the Isles, it's actually known as the Age of Forays, because all these clans that had been under the lordship of the Isles, you know, they'd all, you know, looked to the lordship of the Isles for guidance and leadership. So that was now gone. So you had a lot of these clans are essentially fending for themselves now. You know, so it created a lot more autonomy, because they'd all been kind of paying homage, and they'd all been paying their respects and they sought their allegiance to the lordship of the Isles, the House of Islay. Now that had gone, they all just really spread out, you know. And then I suppose that's a different video of that period there, you know, the Age of Forays, where it was a lot of conflicts and battles, inter-clan battles, because this kind of figurehead, the lordship of the Isles, had been gone. So you had the king of James IV in Edinburgh, but that was quite a bit away from here. You know, this is the Isle of Mull, so that was the King of Scotland. That was in central Scotland. This is quite a bit away from that, you know. And back then, you know, at the end of the 15th century, it would have been even further. You know, they didn't have, you know, like planes and cars. So, I mean, that's probably for a different video, going really into depth about all those different clans. But just to give my own personal opinions and views on this, you know, I wanted to come here and film this battle because it's a really cool one. I nearly got blown away with the rain earlier, as you probably saw, but I just wanted to keep going and try and keep filming. And it's hard because I do research in battles and I really like to get the details of what really happened. But this was really a tricky one because there aren't that much details of the battle. So, you know, you're kind of working blind, but it's maybe something for you to imagine yourself how the battle would have went with the ships, and maybe just let your imagination help you in that respect. But whatever happened here, it was definitely a battle of epic proportions, you know, and it's been summarised as being a naval battle of the likes of epic likes, like going all the way back to Somerled, centuries before, who was the original Lord of the Isles. So folks, if you did enjoy that video, please leave a like and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm, because that's the ones that really help the video grow, folks. So if you liked the video, if you didn't like the video, either way, please just leave a comment, because it really helps the video and the channel grow. So on that note, folks, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.